Welcome to Meanwhile at the Museum, America's #1 Cincinnati-based museum podcast that takes you behind the scenes and beyond Cincinnati Museum Center. On the ones and twos, we have Magic Mitch, our producer.
Hey.
I'm Cody Hefner, and we are joined today by Todd Schulkin, the executive director for the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and Culinary Arts. Todd, I got the full title, correct?
Yeah, it's a big old long one that Julia insisted on.
Like everything with Julia Child, everything's a mouthful, right? She wanted people's mouths to be full. She wanted people to be smiling when they were doing it. So it fits.
That's a great analogy. I have not actually heard that before, so I'm going to use it.
So, Todd, we have you on. We wanted to talk to you because we just opened Julia Child, A Recipe for Life. It's a new featured exhibition here at Cincinnati Museum Center that, among other things, is really about Julia Child, her zest for life, the just sheer force of personality that she was, and the culinary kind of pioneer she was in America. It's not like she was creating food that had never been cooked before, but she was doing it in ways that had never been done before. And she was really showing people, you don't have to be a chef to do this. Like, cooking should be fun. It's not just about sustenance. It's not just about calories and fueling the body, things like that. It should be an enjoyable experience, right?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things the exhibit really brings to life is the context of the time in which Julia was doing it, which is really important. Like, if you're 20 years old right now, you've been a product of the food revolution. But if you go back to when Julia returned to the States in the early 1960s, food was looked at really differently. It was being very industrialized and commodified, and it was sort of, like you were saying, it was being geared more as fuel, and the kind of pleasure and fun of it and the do-it-yourself of it was being minimized. So that was really where Julia stepped in, partly because of her time living in other parts of the world where that wasn't the case, and she was really horrified. And she really did come from a sort of pleasure principle, too. She was most horrified that it didn't taste very good and compared to what she'd been eating, and she thought that would be such a shame if future generations no longer knew what, delicious food tasted like. Yeah, you're 100% right. She didn't invent new dishes. If anything, she popularized existing or traditional dishes. But she really sought out to change Americans' attitudes toward, or even fears of cooking, that they were being convinced, they should no longer want to do.
It's interesting you mentioned food being industrialized because there is a section in the exhibition about TV dinners. Mm-hmm. The cordon off plates, the section plates that you would go heat up and then eat in front of the TV, and then Julia Child becomes known as this TV personality. So it's kind of funny to think of people eating this hard, leathery Salisbury steak in a little tin pan as Julia Child is showing them how to cook coq au vin or something like that.
Well, yeah, she was really almost like a counterculture revolutionary because, I remember as a kid, we did not routinely eat TV dinners, but I wanted to because I watched TV and there was something just uniquely appealing of the whole TV dinners to kids. So you wanted that, and my mom wasn't really for it. I think we tried it occasionally, and I think after a few I realized the novelty wore off and they didn't really taste very good. But it was this movement of progress, and everything was inventive. It's kind of like now that, certain things, like if you remember, juicing is still big, but there was a time where 15 years ago, the smoothie was all the rage and everyone was having smoothies until they discovered most of them were 1,000 calories and,
all sugar.
More,
yeah.
Right. More than a meal, but you weren't realizing it. And so, I think Julia was a little bit anti-fad and going against the grain. So, that's part of her legacy for sure. And I think a lot of chefs who are at the forefront of the food movement now, whatever that means, whether it means, organic produce or it means really inventive dishes, kind of go back to, Julia's raising the alarm bell that maybe we shouldn't look at food as only fuel and we should pay attention to where it comes from.
So if people are approaching this exhibit or this episode of our podcast without knowing who Julia is, who want to learn more about her, can you give us a brief overview of Julia's life? I know it's a big question. She lived a very full life, but just a brief overview of who she was and what she was about.
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of influence, Julia was one of the first celebrity chefs, even though actually she wasn't a chef. She was a trained cook, but to her, a chef was someone who ran a restaurant or a similar kind of dining operation as the head chef. Chef comes from the word head, leader. And she wasn't the first person to ever do a TV cooking show, not at all. There were many before her. But she was the first person to go on TV and teach cooking where it broke through to a national audience. And that's where she ended up having the most influence and exposure. Now, before she got on TV, the opportunity to get on TV was because she had co authored a book called Mastering the Art of French Cooking, which is kind of a seminal tone among American cookbooks. And it was a book that she actually co wrote with two French women, one who sort of dropped out of the process after it was published, and another who was her partner in many things for many years called Simone Beck. And Simone Beck was a French woman. And that book is kind of become a Bible about French cooking. But what it also did is change Americans' views about French cooking as it being unapproachable or hard. And it pioneered a lot of ways that we take for granted now in the ways that modern cookbooks are written, with very precise measurements and instructions and step by step things. Hadn't been done that way with that level of detail before. So it wasn't just the innovation about French cooking, it was the way the book helped people. It was sort of your guide in the kitchen. It was also one of an early book that had a really strong voice to it, which is now quite common in most cookbooks. But Julia brought her voice. And so, many people have described that having that book made them feel like Julia was right there in the kitchen with her. And from there, being on TV, as many people know, can really make your career take off. So that was in the mid 60s to the mid 70s, and in that process, Julia really became a household name. And it was before Food Network, so there weren't that many other people on TV. And she went on to have a lot of influence as a food writer. She continued to do television shows. She did about a dozen over time. And as her career evolved, she kind of changed from putting herself forward to being an introducer of American talent in the food world. Usually chefs, but sometimes other things. And she was very involved in advocacy for the American wine industry. And she also was very big mentor to many people in the food world, whether it was chefs or food writers or winemakers. So she was a co-founder of the International Association of Culinary Professionals, also called IACP, which still exists, which is like kind of an industry professional organization for food professionals. She was a co-founder of something called the American Institute for Wine and Food, the AIWF, with Robert Mondavi, which was to advocate. It was meant to put food and wine together, but its main purpose was advocating for wine. And she actually was involved too in the founding of the James Beard Foundation, because James Beard was
That's
a
right.
good friend of hers. So she was became this kind of big figure in the food world, both for the professional side of it and to the public. There's a lot of elements of her personal life that are quite interesting, but in a nutshell, that was her career, and why she's important in the food world.
Mitch, that's a great question because depending on your age, you've come into Julia in different ways. Maybe you knew her from her cookbook before you knew her as the TV personality, or maybe TV personality, that's where you were first introduced. Or if you're from the younger generation, you are more familiar with her from movies and films they're still making. I mean, the fact that she is still a character that people are exploring and kind of reintroducing to. So there's a spectrum of people and where and how they found Julia. And that's what I love about the exhibition is, I was familiar with who Julia Child was, but I had no idea the full breadth of the full story. And talking about her cookbook, a lot of times cookbooks are here are the recipes, here are the ingredients, this first, this goes with this. But her cookbook was about the techniques and knife work, and here's how you julienne carrots or something like that, because those are the skills that it seems like that's what sets these chefs apart. It's not just knowing the right ingredients. How do you use those? And she made that accessible to people.
Well, I think Julia, when she approached the cookbook, I mean, Julia always said she wasn't like a natural. She didn't learn to cook until she was in her mid 30s when she went to the Cordon Bleu, and she wasn't very good at the beginning. And so you're exactly right. She was very big on technique, but she was also big on technique because it didn't come second nature to her. And she always felt like, and what made her a great teacher, like if I can learn this stuff, then anybody can learn this stuff. But it needs to be presented in a sort of accessible, easy to follow, not rapid fire, step by step way. But that, that was definitely one of her mantras. If I can do it, you can do it. And and then it was coupled with what else she's known for is being fearless, right? And teaching people that it's not about perfection. You're going to have to make mistakes. And all chefs will tell you, you learn the most from the biggest screw ups you make. And most of the best chefs, it's not that they never screw up, they've learned how to fix their mess ups.
So you mentioned that Julia didn't really become a cook until she was in her 30s. How did Julia come into her interest in food?
Well, it was really when she met her husband. So Julia was, many people get confused. Julia was actually a Californian, not a Boston Brahmin. And she was from Pasadena, and she was from a well-to-do family, but not like a super wealthy family. But she was comfortable, and she was raised that way. And she went to Smith College. In that time, it was much rarer for women to even go to university. Not unheard of, but much less common than it is now. But afterward, in her generation and her rank in society, she was expected to just find a husband and get married. She wasn't supposed to use the education for anything beyond that. But she wasn't interested in that. She was, kind of a tall, athletic, not beautiful blonde with long hair. So
she was 6'2", right?
Apparently she was 6'3", and she used to
6'3"
lie and say she was 6'2", so she didn't sound so tall. But that's you'll see it both ways in things. Conventionally, it's 6'2" because that's what she copped to.
There are great photographs in the exhibition that show just how tall she is. I mean, she's just this force. Yeah, it really. I think when you put the height in context like that, and then you look at her personality and her character, it all fits into it.
But if you go back to Julia in her 20s, she was kind of lanky and awkward and goofy, and that personality that comes to life in the exhibit, it didn't fit neatly into being a demure woman of society. And so she was kind of flitting around. And when World War II broke out, she hadn't really found what she wanted to do with her life. And so she decided to join the movement for the war. She was also, back to her height, apparently too tall. She wanted to be a WAC, the Women Armies Corps, but she was too tall. I'm not quite sure what the height restriction was for, but she was too tall.
Height requirements in Jeeps or something.
Yeah, she didn't fit in the whatever the roles. So that led her somehow to the Office of Strategic Services, which is the predecessor to the CIA. And so she joined that aspect of the war movement. It wasn't technically the military, and was then sent to Southeast Asia, in what was Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And that is where she met Paul Child, who was also a diplomat. Ironically, given the news, he was part of the USAID, part of the State Department. He wasn't directly a USAID worker. It didn't exist then. But he was in what was called the Diplomatic Corps. And he did a lot of things like map making and documenting things and communication things that were then used by the military. And that's where they met. And he was very interested in food, and he was more erudite and worldly than Julia. He'd already lived in different places around the world. And it was their first friendship and then relationship where they started, eating the food in Sri Lanka. And then later they were posted to China, and you discovered Chinese food.
It's amazing that Julia Child was in the OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA, and then has this amazing culinary background. So she was CIA adjacent twice with the Central Intelligence Agency and the Culinary Institute of America with her with her passion for that.
Full circle, yeah. She likes those initials.
We were really excited internally at the museum because there's this section that talks about Paul creating exhibits for the government, being that with that design background and the map making and things like that. And then taking that forward, he was very involved in kind of the set and production design for Julia's the French Chef show, right?
Yeah, Paul was very much a polyglot. He was good at languages, he was good at art and drawing. I mean, he considered himself an artist. He painted and he was a photographer. I think the Schlesinger Library has 40,000 negatives of his photography. So the photography to Julia is actually a small part of the collection. And not only did he do it, he was pretty good, and if not very good. And he was very knowledgeable about all kinds of different things. But he was like a black belt. I might get it wrong, in judo, I think.
No
he
kidding.
so he was also tough, and he was good at like building things, and he was also at least 10 years older than Julia. So when they moved back to the States, he unfortunately was sort of indirectly a victim of the McCarthy era and was kind of made to retire.
Because he was stationed in communist China, right? They kind of
I don't
drew that.
No, it didn't have anything to
No?
do with that. I don't think so. I mean, he was stationed by the U.S. government there, with a lot of other people who were not. I can't remember what it was about why. I don't really have any explanation of why he was targeted.
I don't think a lot of people had explanations for why why people were targeted during McCarthyism. So
But he was accused, and in the end, I think the easiest path, the path of least resistance, was to retire, or take early retirement. And as a result, Julia's career was taking off, and he kind of became her partner because he had the time and ability. And like you said, he was very organized and detail oriented, and he helped Julia. So they really were a team.
it's amazing to imagine there's a party, Paul Child is there and is like the most interesting person in the room. And then Julia walks in, who is the largest personality in the room, and just makes, Paul secondary at that point. But that's something that stands out throughout the exhibition, and is their relationship and just how supportive they were of each other. It sort of sells it short to say that he really helped kind of elevate her career, and not in the sense that he's opening doors or anything, but he was just a wonderful sounding board and partner for her, that I think if he wasn't, Julia would have no time for him. I mean, she was such a force, and they just had such an adoring, supportive relationship.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure Julia was quoted as saying if there would be no Julia Child without Paul Child, and that I think some of it was the age difference, that he had had a career that he had succeeded in. He was ready to take a step back. I think the accusations were really difficult, but it meant that I think maybe particularly for the period, he was more comfortable being the number two and was happy to take a step back. I also think personality wise, he was much more introverted than Julia. He wasn't particularly a people person. And so Julia fulfilled that, and it didn't faze him to let her. She just had that magical quality that certain celebrities do, where when you speak to them, they zero in on you in a way that it's like you're the only person in the room, and it's genuine. It's not even fake. Julia really loved people, was very interested in them, and was as interested in them as she was in herself. And so that, she just had this ability to make people feel good. And I think it's some of that charisma that also, translated to television.
We're learning a lot about Julia right now. I want to take a step back and meet Todd for a second. So you are the executive director of the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts. Talk to us about your role and how you first became involved with the foundation.
My background is in intellectual property. I started many years ago. I was trained as a film agent for primarily movies, and then I went to business school, and I majored in business school in marketing. And so I also have a background in advertising, PR, and marketing, ad research, stuff like that. And so when the foundation started growing and Julia's fame continued, particularly as you mentioned with both the movie Julie and Julia by Nora Ephron, which came out in 2009, and when there was the 100th birthday celebration for Julia, she would have been 100 in 2012. Those events continued to sort of grow Julia's legacy and attention and interest, maybe beyond they'd initially expected. And the other unique thing, it's not unheard of, but it's unique, is that Julia left everything to this foundation that she created while she was still alive. So she left all of her intellectual property, her copyrights and her books, her rights, they vary, but to her television programs, and all her copyrights to her papers and other things to the foundation. So the foundation's imbued in a different way than, for example, that is not true of the James Beard Foundation. It was named in honor of James Beard. It doesn't hold any, to my knowledge, it doesn't hold any of the rights of his papers or intellectual property. But our foundation does, and they needed someone with a background in that, and I happened to have at the time been working a little bit in the food world with cookbooks, and but I also knew about intellectual property and brand management. So that's how I was brought in, and I also had known Julia personally.
Did you?
Yeah, through she was my now ex-wife's kind of fairy godmother in a way.
No kidding.
She was a very close friend of my ex-mother-in-law who is an established, now retired cookbook author, and she had a cooking school in France called La Varenne, which Julia and Paul had been original investors in.
Well, I was going to ask, when you first were introduced to Julia Child in any form, I did not expect that. So were you familiar with her before meeting her personally?
You know, I totally knew who she was, but I didn't come from like a foodie household. I grew up in Kansas City. It was like I was aware of who she was, but it wasn't, my mom didn't collect cookbooks.
She didn't cook a lot of barbecue?
No, you went to the experts to have barbecue. It would be
Right.
very, very, very hard to beat. There's a funny story there, but I'll just say that where my parents used to get their cars fixed is now a great barbecue restaurant in Kansas City.
I think those make the best barbecue restaurants, right? It's the unconventional ones.
Yeah, I don't quite know why, but it's really good. It's changed its name, but it's called Joe's Kansas City. It's one of my favorites. But yeah, no, my mom did not.
We're looking for sponsors, so just name drop. That's okay.
Yeah. No, we tried to have them on our podcast. Didn't work out. But yeah, and my parents are not from Kansas City, so barbecue is not their background. Arthur Bryant's is another favorite in Kansas City. So now I've lost all track of what I was supposed to be talking about.
When you
now
first,
I'm hungry.
When you first were introduced to Julia Child.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So like I said, kind of like you, I knew who she was, I knew about her, but I wasn't someone who watched The French Chef constantly, and I don't think I owned a copy of Mastering the Art of French Cooking. But like I said, I married someone whose mother was a trained chef, like had gone to the Cordon Bleu, and food was her career. She ran a cooking school. She's Anne Willen, as her name. Anne wrote more than 50 cookbooks, more than Julia. So that's when I first got to know her, and part of it was we had moved to Los Angeles so I could become an agent, and Julia had moved to, she was still spending time in Santa Barbara, and I'll never forget my mother-in-law Anne said, "Oh, Julia's up in Santa Barbara and she's all by herself and she must be lonely, and you guys should go visit her." And I remember distinctly coming home to the apartment we had then, and there was a message on, if you remember, answering machines, and which had a little tape in them.
We're a history museum. We've got some of those.
You've got some answering machines. Maybe some of your audience has never seen them. And there was a message on the answering machine from Julia saying, "Hello, it's Julia Child, and Em and Todd, you should come up and see me." Which now I regret not saving that little tape because it was so fun. But I was like, oh my God, Julia Child is on our answering machine. Now, I know now that Julia was not lonely in Santa Barbara and had tons of friends and lots of company, and, just was someone who couldn't be lonely. She was so sociable. So the idea that, she needed some company. But I think she, had a long-standing, my ex was literally born in Boston, I think the same year that her mother met Julia. So they had that connection of, basically always, at least for my ex, knowing each other. So there was,
Wow.
It was a very personal kind of family thing. Now, at that time, Julia was still pretty busy, and so were we. So it's not like in my era we spent tons of time with her. And Paul had already passed away.
So, I grew up kind of the heart of, PBS. You had Mr. Rogers and Bob Ross and Julia Child. Like I was aware kind of the ecosystem, but where I first learned of Julia Child was Dan Aykroyd on Saturday Night Live. And I can distinctly remember, I wonder if my mom still has the tape, my brothers making Christmas cookies in the basement one year, imitating the Julia Child skit from Saturday Night Live. As soon as I went into the exhibition, I was like, they have to address that, right? They have to address this kind of larger than life personality that she was, and it is. Do you know, like, how did Julia receive things like that?
Well, apparently she loved it. And she had it.
I can see that.
I did not know this personally, but I think it's Paula Johnson, who's the curator of at the Smithsonian, where American History Museum, where Julia's kitchen is, and that Julia had a videotape of it that she had accessible in her kitchen. And when people would come over, she'd play it for them and howl with laughter. And I think the other part that maybe made it approachable to her or something is apparently, I believe Dan Aykroyd, I think he's Canadian, and his mom was a fan or into cooking, and that's where he knew about it. And so there was a certain amount of homage and love, as crazy as the skit was. And for listeners who maybe haven't seen it, you can Google it and watch it on YouTube. But Dan Aykroyd does this impression of Julia where it starts out lovely, and then there's blood spurting everywhere where she's cutting off limbs and things like that, and it gets, sort of grotesque.
But I think throughout, there's always that it's fine, things happen, and it's so chaotic, but she's unflappable. Well, Dan Aykroyd.
Yeah, exactly. That's the gag,
yeah.
right? She's so unflappable that even as she's cutting off fingers and limbs, she's just telling everyone to go on. But I think the funny thing about that skit is you're 100% right. I think for a lot of particularly people under 50, their association with Julia are through things like the Julie and Julia movie with Amy Adams and Meryl Streep, or from the Dan Aykroyd skit, or there's some really funny things of Julia when she was on David Letterman. They had amazing chemistry, and I don't think Dave cooked at all, so he was like totally had no idea what was going on. But if you can watch it, those are hilarious. And because she really like eggs him on, and she totally can take him on.
Yeah.
But from the Aykroyd thing, some of that cultural stuff has confused people. There are so many people that are convinced certain things happen. Like most people would say, oh yeah, I loved it when Julia dropped the whole chicken or the whole turkey on the floor. There is no video that shows that. But people are convinced it happens. And it's like this mind meld of these different things of her fame and parody and stuff together. I mean, I don't think it bothered her. It just was like odd how even very well-versed people have those views.
Well, you say that. It's going through the exhibition and seeing the clips and seeing the videos, seeing films like Julie and Julia, and there are several others. As great as Meryl Streep is, and as good as any actor is, you can't match the personality that Julia is. You can never play it so big that you're beyond who Julia Child was as a person. It's so infectious when you see it too.
I know. I think what's really amazing still is that, think, oh, I'm just going to watch a minute of it. And then suddenly it's 10 minutes later. She's just like entrancing. There's something about, and there have even been academics who've studied her like body movements and physicality and why she's so captivating. She just is. She was one of those personalities that could really connect like through the lens. And that's one of my favorite things, which isn't really, it's not a secret, but it's not public. We worked on a television show that didn't come to fruition, but was developed into what's called a pilot presentation. It's like a mini pilot done on the cheap, basically. And in that, now I'm going to say the concept, it doesn't make any sense, but what ended up happening, it was two comics who were watching her do a demonstration, not so much technique, but how to make a dish. Might have been a bouche de Noël, and then they were meant to replicate it. And the idea was that they would just make a total mess of it, and it would be like a disaster, and it would be entertaining. The problem was Julia is a good enough teacher that from the grave, these two comics both made something that was pretty close to what it was supposed to be. Yeah. The problem was that sort of eliminated the drama, because Julia was still like, but I always think that was so striking that, and neither of them had any cooking training. They just followed her doing it, and it worked. And I think that's a testament to how good she was on television.
So through your work with the foundation and knowing Julia personally, have you come to cook and using her as a guide at all?
I do cook. I was more taught by Ann Willen, who I talked about, because I spent in the tenure as a family member, and she was a cooking teacher too. So you couldn't be around Ann without learning, because she was magnificent at getting everyone else to do all the labor, and a skill I think she learned in part from Julia. Julia was maybe a little bit more hands-on until the end, but most people describe the second you went to Irving Street in Julia's house in Cambridge, she put you to work. Uh, Topping and tailing green beans, or sautéing a hamburger, or chopping onions. And when you're with someone who's that skilled and versed, you're going to pick things up.
How involved were you in the exhibition? Were you involved in the design of the exhibition, or where did you fall in that process?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely involved, because the exhibition started at a museum in Napa Valley called the Napa Valley Museum Yountville, and it was originally an exhibition based on a book that Julia's great nephew and a woman named Katie Pratt, Julia's great nephew is called Alex Prudhomme, and they did back to what we were talking about before. They did a book with Thames and Hudson called France is a Feast, and it's the first ever published collection of Paul's photographs of Julia, and it's kind of half Julia in Paris in the 1950s and half Paul's images of France in the 50s. Um, and it's a beautiful book. It's essentially an art book. And then they did an exhibit of it with these photographs. And I think they had something like 30 times the audience they'd ever had at an exhibit there.
Really?
And they said, oh, well, there's something here. And so they came back to us and said, could we take it on the road? Because we think if it's this successful here, people would want to see it, and everybody enjoyed it. And they had added, it was mostly photographs, but they had added some stuff like you could stand next to Julia to see how tall she was. You could submit your own recipes. They had a couple other artifacts. And there was a long sort of development process, and we ended up working with this exhibition company called Flying Fish out of Minneapolis in Australia. And they said, we're very interested, but we actually think there's a lot more to say, and we'd like to expand it to be comprehensive about Julia's life from beginning to end. And the other thing I like to say is it's kind of surprising, because you talked about the whole Julia verse. There have been multiple things, her kitchens in the Smithsonian. There was a TV show on Max. There was a documentary. There's Julie and Julia. But actually, all of those things only delve into pieces of her life. They're not actually that comprehensive. Some of the kitchen exhibition in the Smithsonian touches on her, but it's really about the kitchen and the kitchen's significance. The Max show was about when she became a TV star. The documentary is broader. Julie and Julia is only about the time when, as Meryl Streep as Julia, was meeting Paul in France. So there actually hasn't been, other than in book form in the biographies, beginning to end. So we realized that there was sort of a gap for that, especially for many people who have only one exposure to Julia or who she was. And so then Flying Fish hired designers, hired writers who did the development, but we reviewed it, we consulted on it. We had a pretty light touch because they did a really great job.
It's so true, because when I first walked through, I would read a panel and I'd say, what? And I read another one. And I was like, really? You think you know so much about her life because she was a very public figure. And as I'm walking through, I'm like, I did not expect to. I thought I was just going to refresh a lot of stuff. And you're learning so much because she did so much. I mean, the portion that we know and the portion that we see, that we've seen her on TV, is such a small subset of her life. But the exhibition does an amazing job of pulling you in right away. And from a design perspective, it's so bright and it's vibrant. It feels like her. I mean, it feels like it has that energy and that warmth to it. That walking in right away as a museum professional, you start to pick things apart and appreciate them in different components. And I think from a design perspective, you could do this and be very flat about it and still be very interesting. But as soon as you walk in, you feel that energy with it that I think is it was very unexpected for me when I walked in.
I really enjoy how interactive the exhibit is. Like when you go to the kitchen set, you can like open drawers and cabinets in the refrigerator, and you're seeing different pieces in there. There's like a video element, a screen in a drawer, examples of her tools. Then you can like be on camera on the cooking set. So I thought it was really cool.
We had we had a preview of it, and we had a woman in, and she brought her young daughter who's probably 3, and she's in around the kitchen set. And I was like, oh, this is going to be precious. This is going to be, a very cute experience. And she starts opening drawers and stuff. And I was like, those open? I tried the oven and it didn't open. And so I figured, no. All this is it's a prop. But then turn around and the fridge opens and this cabinet, and there's audio and video and everything in those. I was so shocked. And this little kid's like, let me give you a quick tour of the exhibit, big guy.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I like best about it is that it not only brings Julia to life, but it can immerse you in her story and experience in all different ways. There's something to appeal to everyone. There's, the romance of taking you back to France and her first meal in Rouen. There's her relationship with Paul, and you can replicate her bathtub Valentine's Day cards that she and Paul used to send to people. And, I love the giant copy of Mastering the Art, which kind of seemed
cool.
gimmicky, but the designers explained one of the reasons they did it like that is the book is so important and has been so influential, continues to be a bestseller. I think it was in the top 3 cookbooks around Black Friday this year, which
Really?
It's a 60-year-old book.
And we did some promotion. I think that we might be partly responsible for that.
Thank you very much. You can have it. As long as we get the royalties, you can have it.
Of course.
But they said, it's more than a gimmick, is if we just put the book out, it's a regular book size, it would be very hard for a group of people to see it. But when it's larger than life, then lots of people at the same time can experience the contents of it. And then, of course, putting yourself on the set of the French Chef, or a replica of the French Chef set, and actually be on camera and film your stuff. That's just a crowd pleaser, especially in this day and age where everyone wants to have their own podcast or YouTube show or whatever it is.
Yeah, it works exactly as you imagine what exactly is it designed to, because people are drawn to it. They're standing back. They're trying to figure out where to take their pictures. They're lining the camera up so that they get that Instagrammable moment or whatever out of it. And to go back, you talked about Paul being this amazing photographer. You're looking at all these photos of Julia on set, mid-take, mid-shot, and they're amazing. Like they're wonderful promo photos that they would release today for a show. And you look at yeah, you've got them right behind you. Paul took those, right?
Yeah, almost all of them, the photos that you see, particularly the black and white ones from the French Chef days, Paul took. There are a few that he didn't, but by and large, they didn't have a budget for more. One of the ways the show succeeded is Paul and Julia gave a lot to it, even though the budget that GBH, or then WGBH, could give them. So it was, they had the skills and the effort and the time, but he really did a lot. Like you said, designed the set and took the photographs and helped her with the cue cards and all of that.
And again, that's a really, I say a minor detail because you're looking at the photo tag on a lot of those, but it just highlights their relationship and how supportive. And I was talking we had some media in for the opening of it, and we said he's the original Instagram boyfriend. He's taken all these photos, but it's so amazing. These shots of her, like you would hire someone and pay someone to take those, and that comes out of a meeting to say, these are the ones, this is what's going to sell. And it's just Paul being invested and engaged in what she's doing and her success. And I think if you walk in and you look at them in that context, it really just expands what you're getting out of the exhibition.
Well, and I think actually that goes back to the source of the exhibition, the Francis of Feast. Many of the photos in that book of Julia are almost racy because they go back to the time when their relationship was really in early full bloom, and Julia's much younger, and Paul was, to get colorful, obsessed with Julia's long legs, and that romance. And like you were saying, the Instagram boyfriend, well, the best photos are when someone who really is in love with you is taking the photos of you, and that helped. He was a good photographer, but he was also photographing basically his favorite subject.
Listen, you talk about the long legs. I'm just going to spoil this for people. And the back gallery of the exhibition, they're on display. I mean, I think if Paul could place a photo, I know which one he put in there.
Yeah, and I think for people who know Julia from her later series where she was, older and more grandmotherly-ish, to see these photos, there's even a couple of Julia smoking a cigarette, which of course, in those days was healthy. So
I talked to multiple people who said, I didn't realize how much of a badass Julia Child was. The photo you're talking about, I don't know, Mitch, help me out on the maybe she has sandals on and she's like on a beach. She has a cigarette in her hand and she's just kind of leaning over with her arm on her knee on the beach. And she does look like she just looks like this badass woman. I think it's in the section that talks about her and the OSS. So it all fits in that. You see this sort of world traveling, like jet setting adventurer almost.
She did just have this kind of a cool confidence in herself, like kind of all the time. Like when she was on the kitchen set, even when she'd make a mistake, she just, yep, that's how it happens. But like it didn't. She made a mistake almost not look like a mistake because of just how cool she was about it.
And Todd, you talked about her physicality, just the way her body moves because she is so tall, and everyone has that tall friend they know that seems like they have kind of awkward movements because they've got such long legs to move. But she's got this. I mean, she's all over the place in the kitchen. Like she has these large movements, and when she's talking, she bends over and snaps back up as she's speaking. And so you almost think like that's kind of nervous energy, but it's just this confidence. It's just her just unconsciously filling the space with who she is.
Well, I think one of the best quotes Julia had, because she was very quotable, was she would say, "Never apologize." And I don't think that was necessarily something she was born with, but she learned, particularly maybe because she went to the Cordon Bleu and she was the only woman in the class with a bunch of American GIs who were all men. But she learned to not be apologetic for things you don't need to apologize for, like, i.e., that mistakes happen and that you're going to drop something or you're going to forget something, but that you don't need to beat yourself up over that. And I think that was something she learned or taught herself and found very freeing. So she really wanted to empower, other people with that. Mitch, I was just going to say something about, I actually think of Julia was kind of a partier and a party girl. I mean, A, she was hyper social, and B, she was a little bit, I think she would have even said when she was young, a dilettante. So she definitely, I think because she was so friendly and positive, she maybe to some people seems like, and old fashioned for now, it seems like a goody two shoes. But I mean, Julia could drink you under the table. She could outlast you at any social event. People always commented, like, in her 80s, she would be like, other people would be like, I need to go to bed. And Julia's like, let's go out for a nightcap. I mean, she was just had incredible energy.
Well, I think it's, that personality that really, secured her role on television, because she initially was discovered for TV in doing TV interviews for the Cookbook.
Yep.
And just that personality, they were like, we got to put this woman on TV more.
Well, actually, that's probably giving WGBH too much credit. I mean, the Max show kind of messes with that. But in reality, what happened is she went on this show called I've Been Reading, which was kind of a nerdy professor's book show. And she decided rather than talk, she was going to do an omelet demonstration, which had sort of never been done on that show. And they didn't really have the right equipment. And it was a bit awkward. But she was entertaining enough. I think the number was WGBH got 27 letters of saying, who is that woman? She's great. Put her on. Now, it doesn't seem that many, but I guess the lore goes, they never got 27 letters about any show before. Right. So that's when they, called Julia up and said, maybe we should try and see if there's something, what do you think? And that's how, in the Max series, Julia initiates it and she kind of keeps it a secret from Paul. In real life, it was her being on the show to promote mastering. In that case, she did the appearance alone because Simca was back in France. And that, touched a chord with an audience in Boston. But, there were so many innovations to that show. So when WGBH invited Julia to come in and do it, there was no prescribed format for how food TV works or how teaching shows or demo shows. And again, she wasn't the first person. She didn't invent the genre, but she kind of perfected the genre. There was a lot of things they did on that show that are now commonplace that hadn't been done that way before. For example, having the dishes halfway cooked or pre-cooked and then swapping them out. That was an innovation of theirs. Later on, it was one of the first shows to be closed captioned,
Oh,
which
wow.
I think was just a matter of timing, which is they developed the technology and Julia was the most popular PBS show at the time, so they said, let's try it on that. So, there was just a lot of innovation that happened. And again, a lot of Julia's amazing life was timing. Would Julia have met Paul if World War II hadn't happened? All of these different serendipitous events. But I think if there's a lesson to take away from it, a lot of those things happened because Julia was very willing to put herself out there. She was willing to say yes, to go do. And I think that's part of why she remains such an inspiring figure.
To go back when you said, Julia said, don't apologize.
Never apologize.
Never apologize. I'm not going to apologize for this, but I'm curious about your take on this. What Bob Ross was to painting, Julia Child was to cooking.
Do I agree with that?
Yeah, do you agree with that?
I do, although I feel like, and we've actually, some of the guys who helped bring Bob Ross back on digital have done some stuff with Julia's content.
Really?
So I did not know a lot about Bob Ross. Like I did not watch him. I didn't find it meditative. I wasn't part of the cult. But I think with Bob Ross, he was a cult figure and he completely disappeared and has sort of come back in the digital age. And I feel like that's a little less true of Julia. She may have disappeared from television, but her books have continued to be
Right.
popular. And now, just on that note, if I could plug it, Julia's widely available and doing well on streaming. You can watch The French Chef on Pluto, on PBS Food there, on Amazon on the PBS channels. You can watch, I think, several different shows are on Roku, and it's just amazing to see. And to what we were talking about before, that she's so mesmerizing that people are watching these like 50-year-old shows. Some aren't 50 years old, but The French Chef certainly is.
She is so captivating. I mean, I feel like usually when someone's doing a biopic or they're doing a movie or something based on a real life figure, it's always a little heightened to how they were in reality. And like I said, I don't think anyone can match Julia in reality. I think if you're a director, I think every take you're saying, play it bigger, play it bigger, play it bigger, and you're still not going to hit it. But yeah, I mean, she was unapologetically herself. We have this exhibition here at Cincinnati Museum Center, Julia Child, A Recipe for Life. What do you hope people walk away with when they leave the exhibition?
Well, I think from the foundation's point of view, our mission is really about carrying out her legacy, both making sure people understand it and then continuing it on. Like part of our mission is to do and support the causes that Julia did while she was still alive, which has a lot to do with advancing the food industry, professionalism in food, and really advocating for people to keep cooking and do home cooking as well as support chefs and restaurants and the wine industry. So we want them to take that away, but I think there's all these personal lessons that we've talked about. As Julia's example was inspiring in so many different ways, but I think in the bottom line it's also like what I just talked about. If she can do it, you can do it. And to not be held back by limitations, whether that's, as Mitch was talking about, in the kitchen because you might make a mistake, or in life because you're not sure. And I think that back to we were talking about the physicality, even her physical resemblance is that lesson. If you went to cast a food show right now, or an Instagram reel or whatever, you'd be like, well, Julia's maybe not pretty enough, she's too tall, she kind of has this weird voice, like she doesn't fit any standard definitions of celebrity, for example, but yet there she was. And so that's also what we hope, is that it's inspiring.
I think people are really going to enjoy it. So it is here. It's at Cincinnati Museum Center. Be sure to check it out. It is open through May 18th, 2025. So you've got some time to see it. But I like to tell people, see it early, because you're probably going to want to come back. You're going to miss something. You're going to hear your friends say something. You're like, I didn't know that was in there. You're going to have a really great time. Todd, thank you for spending some time with us, sharing your stories. I had no idea we were going to get to know Julia firsthand, or I guess secondhand from you. That's really incredible.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and we're excited to hear what people think of it in Cincinnati, and hopefully from farther afield in Ohio and beyond. So keep us posted, and thank you for bringing it to the museum.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks for the great work you're doing with the foundation. It's really wonderful that Julia can continue to live on and inspire people in that way. Thank you all for listening. Remember, if you liked what you heard, rate, review, and subscribe. But more importantly, come see for yourself. Visit cincymuseum.org for the latest reasons to visit. If you have any questions or you just want to tell us how much you love the show, email us at meanwhile@cincymuseum.org. Thanks for listening.